I thought finals week would break me, and it almost did. At the time, I was a third-year engineering student specializing in biomedical systems, which is the sort of major people describe as impressive in a tone that quietly suggests concern for your mental health. Finals week in our program was not a single exam or even a cluster of exams, but a carefully orchestrated endurance test involving cumulative written finals, multi-day lab practicals, design reviews, and a capstone project defense that determined whether the last 3 years of stress had been worth something tangible or merely educational. By that Monday, I had not slept more than 4 hours in a row in nearly a week, and my brain felt like it was constantly buffering, always a half second, behind my own thoughts. The apartment I shared with 2 other students had become a rotating workspace rather than a home, with notebooks open on every flat surface and half-finished cups of coffee growing cold wherever someone had set them down in a moment of distraction. Franklin was already awake when I stepped into the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his laptop balanced on a stack of textbooks, surrounded by pages of handwritten equations arranged in a way that suggested both intention and quiet desperation. He was the kind of student professors remembered, not because he talked the most, but because he was consistent, meticulous, and frustratingly calm even under pressure. Franklin and I had been paired for our capstone project months earlier, and what began as a purely academic partnership had evolved into something like a shared survival pact. We did not motivate each other with inspirational speeches or dramatic pep talks. Instead, we functioned like 2 people silently agreeing to keep showing up, day after day, even when exhaustion blurred the edges of our focus. Finals week was supposed to be the culmination of everything, the point where effort translated cleanly into outcome. That illusion lasted until mid-morning, when my phone buzzed with an email notification that would quietly alter the trajectory of the entire week. The subject line was short and unassuming, something administrative and forgettable, the kind of message students usually skim or ignore. I opened it anyway, mostly out of habit, and read it once, then again, before realizing my heart had begun to beat faster without my permission. According to the message, there was a discrepancy in our project documentation. A submission timestamp had been flagged as late. The system had recorded our final design packet as uploaded 12 minutes past the deadline, which automatically triggered a review process and a provisional grade reduction pending investigation. 12 minutes was nothing in normal life, but in finals week, it was catastrophic. I sat down on the arm of the couch without remembering the decision to do so, rereading the email as if repetition might rearrange its meaning. Our project had been uploaded the night before, hours before the deadline, after Franklin and I had triple-checked every component and watched the confirmation screen load together. There had been no rush, no last-minute scramble, no reason for error. Franklin noticed the shift in my posture before I said anything. He did not ask questions right away, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. Instead, he waited until I handed him my phone, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the situation to exist fully between us. We checked the submission portal together. The timestamp displayed on the interface contradicted our own records, listing the upload at a time when both of us had already been asleep. Franklin pulled up the confirmation email saved in his inbox, complete with the correct time, date, and system-generated receipt number. The 2 records existed side by side, mutually exclusive, and equally official. This was when frustration began to settle into something heavier than panic. Engineering programs love objectivity. Numbers are supposed to speak for themselves. Systems are designed to eliminate ambiguity. But this discrepancy lived in the narrow space between platforms, where responsibility blurred and accountability dissolved into procedure. We contacted the course coordinator immediately, attaching screenshots, receipts, and a detailed explanation written in careful, neutral language. The response came hours later, polite and distant, informing us that the issue would be reviewed after finals week concluded, and that no adjustments could be made until then. That meant walking into our defense with a provisional penalty already. Attached to our names, a silent mark that would color every evaluation whether the reviewers acknowledged it or not. By the end of the first day, the campus felt different. Students moved faster, spoke less, and avoided eye contact in the hallways, as if stress were contagious. In the engineering building, lights stayed on long after sunset, illuminating rows of hunched figures locked in quiet battles with problem sets and simulation software. I tried to study for my written finals that evening, but my thoughts kept circling back to the timestamp, to the idea that something we had done correctly was being treated as a failure by a system designed to reward precision. The unfairness of it pressed against me from the inside, making it difficult to focus on anything else. Tuesday began with lab practicals, the kind that required steady hands and clear thinking, neither of which I felt I possessed anymore. I moved through the exercises mechanically, relying on muscle memory and repetition, acutely aware that any mistake could compound the damage already done. Franklin and I crossed paths briefly in the hallway between sessions, exchanging a look that carried more information than words ever could. We were both still functioning, but only just, and finals week was only getting started. By the time I returned to the apartment that night, the sense of being watched by invisible metrics had settled deeply into my bones. I reviewed our project files again, checking for anything that might explain the discrepancy, anything that would allow me to believe this was a simple error rather than the beginning of something worse. That was when I noticed something subtle, something I had missed before because I had not been looking for it, a version history entry that did not belong. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, a minor access log timestamp buried deep within the system's activity report. But it showed that our project folder had been opened and interacted with during a window when neither Franklin nor I had been logged in. At first, I assumed it was an automated process, some background system check or archival function. But the IE access tag did not match the usual system identifiers. It was associated with a user role that should not have had editing privileges at all. I stared at the screen for a long time, letting the implication settle slowly, like sediment sinking to the bottom of a glass. Someone else had been there. Once the idea took shape in my mind, it refused to leave, expanding quietly into every corner of my thoughts until it colored everything I did. Someone else had accessed our project, not accidentally, not through a system glitch, but through credentials that allowed visibility without accountability. It was the kind of access reserved for teaching assistants, lab supervisors, or peer mentors assigned to oversee multiple project groups. The realization arrived with a slow, cold clarity. This was not a random malfunction. This was procedural, invisible, and perfectly deniable. Finals week does strange things to perception. Every small irregularity begins to feel significant, every delay like an accusation. I printed the access log and slipped it into my binder, unsure of what I would do with it, but unwilling to let it exist only digitally, where it could be altered or disappear without explanation. Tuesday blurred into Wednesday with very little distinction between them. I moved from exam to exam, from lab to lecture hall, carrying the weight of the discovery without the relief of confirmation. Franklin and I communicated mostly through shared documents and short practical messages, conserving energy the way hikers ration water. On Wednesday afternoon, between a thermodynamics final and a systems modeling review, I found myself sitting in the engineering atrium, watching students pass by without really seeing them. That was when I noticed something else, something that had been present all along but had not previously registered as important. Another project group, one we had quietly outperformed all semester, was suddenly receiving attention. Their work was not bad, but it was uneven, rushed in places, and built on assumptions that our faculty had explicitly discouraged. Yet their advisor had begun highlighting them in emails, praising their innovation and timely execution, phrases that landed differently now that our own submission was under review. At the center of that group was a graduate teaching assistant named Mark, someone who had rotated through multiple lab sections and had access to nearly every project folder in the department. Mark was efficient, well-liked by faculty, and openly competitive in a way that felt performative rather than genuine. He had also made no secret of the fact that he was applying for a highly selective doctoral program and needed strong departmental support to secure his recommendation letters. I did not want to believe what my brain was assembling, because it felt paranoid, like the kind of story stress invents to give itself a focal point. But the pieces aligned too cleanly to ignore. The unauthorized access, the timestamp discrepancy, the sudden elevation of a competing project under the supervision of someone with motive, opportunity, and insulation from consequences. Franklin came over that evening, bringing takeout since neither of us had the energy to cook. We ate in near silence, surrounded by notes and diagrams, the apartment lit by the blue glow of our screens. When I finally showed him the access log, he studied it carefully, his expression unchanged, but his stillness more pronounced than usual. We did not talk about revenge or confrontation. We talked about how systems respond not to emotion but to evidence. Franklin suggested we start logging everything, every access, every inconsistency, every public mention of the other project, not to accuse, but to preserve context. Thursday. Arrived with the weight of inevitability. Our project defense was scheduled for Friday morning with the same faculty who would later review the flagged submission issue. We rehearsed quietly all evening. As I spoke through the technical framework, explaining decisions and constraints with careful precision, I felt something settle inside me. The work was real. The effort was documented. Whatever happened next would not erase that. By the time finals week reached its midpoint, the frustration had transformed. It was no longer sharp or panicked, but dense and steady, like pressure at depth. I understood then that the real conflict was not the timestamp or the unauthorized access, but the system that allowed ambition to hide behind procedure, that rewarded proximity to power more than integrity. On Friday morning, as Franklin and I walked toward the defense room, carrying our binders and laptops like armor, I felt calm for the first time all week. Not because I believed the system would be fair, but because I knew exactly where I stood within it. The defense room was colder than the rest of the building. Not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed it the moment we stepped inside. The air conditioning hummed steadily, indifferent to the fact that this room represented the last formal judgment of 3 years of work. Faculty members filtered in one by one, setting down laptops and folders, exchanging polite nods without conversation. This was not a space for encouragement. It was a space for assessment. Franklin set up our presentation with quiet efficiency. I watched his hands as he connected cables and adjusted settings, noting how steady they were compared to how mine felt, like they were operating a half second behind my intentions. I grounded myself by focusing on details: the alignment of chairs, the faint scuff marks on the floor, the muted glow of the projector warming up. When the defense began, it unfolded exactly as we had prepared for. There was no dramatic introduction, no personal framing. We moved through our slides methodically, explaining design choices. We spoke plainly, without embellishment, trusting the work to carry itself. Questions came, precise and technical, the kind designed to probe understanding rather than provoke. Franklin answered some, I answered others, and occasionally we built on each other's explanations without breaking rhythm. I could feel the faculty evaluating not just our answers, but our composure, the quiet cohesion between us that suggested this was not a last-minute assembly, but a sustained collaboration. No one mentioned the provisional penalty. No one acknowledged the discrepancy. It hovered unspoken, a silent variable influencing the room in ways impossible to quantify. When it was over, the faculty thanked us with professional detachment and asked us to step outside while they deliberated. We stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall beneath a bulletin board layered with outdated flyers and announcements for opportunities that already felt irrelevant. Franklin exhaled slowly, like someone releasing air they had been holding for days. I mirrored the motion without realizing it, my body responding to his in the absence of conscious instruction. Whatever happened next, the defense itself was finished. There was no going back to adjust tone or wording. The work now belonged to them. Later that afternoon, an email arrived confirming what we already suspected. The provisional penalty remained in place pending further review. No timeline was provided and no explanation was offered beyond a reference to standard procedure. Standard procedure is an effective shield. It absorbs responsibility without appearing to do so. As finals week continued, the effects of that shield became increasingly visible. The competing project group received an informal invitation to present their work at an upcoming departmental showcase, an opportunity typically reserved for projects that demonstrated exceptional originality or impact. Their invitation came before final grades were even posted. I watched the announcement circulate through student channels, noting the reactions, the quiet recalibrations of expectation. In an environment where opportunities were scarce and reputations fragile, perception mattered almost as much as performance. The access logs continued to update. Each day, usually late at night, our project folder showed signs of activity from the same user role, always brief, always undocumented beyond a timestamp and an identifier. Franklin and I stopped discussing whether it was happening intentionally. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss. Instead, we expanded our documentation. We logged not just access times, but contextual events like emails we sent, Announcements we made and shifts in faculty attention. We were not building a case in the legal sense, but we were building a narrative, one grounded in chronology rather than accusation. By Sunday, finals week had hollowed the campus out. Many students had already left, dragging suitcases across cracked sidewalks, their stress dissipating into something like relief. Those who remained moved like ghosts, existing between obligations rather than within them. I should have felt relieved too. Most of my exams were finished. The worst was over. But the unresolved nature of the conflict kept my mind from settling. There is something uniquely exhausting about waiting for a system to decide your fate without telling you when or how it will do so. That evening, Franklin forwarded me an email he had received by mistake. It was addressed to Mark, the teaching assistant, but had been sent to a distribution list that included Franklin due to an outdated alias. The message was brief, congratulatory, and informal, praising Mark for mentoring a standout team and expressing enthusiasm about their upcoming showcase presentation. I stared at the email for a long time, feeling something in me finally crystallize. This was not about sabotage in the dramatic sense. No files had been deleted. No data had been altered beyond timestamps that could be attributed to system behavior. This was about influence, about shaping outcomes by nudging systems just enough that they tipped in a desired direction without ever visibly breaking. That night, I wrote one final summary, not of evidence, but of impact. I documented how the unresolved penalty affected our evaluations, how the unauthorized access coincided with administrative actions favoring another group, how the lack of transparency compounded stress during an already extreme period. I did not send it to anyone. Instead, I saved it. Grades were released the following Wednesday without ceremony. I logged into the portal from my desk, my coffee untouched beside me, my cursor hovering longer than necessary before clicking through. The numbers loaded quickly, indifferent to the buildup they represented. Our project grade reflected the provisional penalty. It was not catastrophic, but it was enough to matter, enough to shift class rankings and alter how transcripts would be read by anyone scanning for excellence rather than competence. Enough to feel intentional, even if it was technically justified. Franklin texted me when he saw his results. I did not respond right away. There was nothing to say that would improve the situation, and silence felt more honest than forced reassurance. That afternoon, a separate email arrived, this one from the department chair. It was addressed to all students involved in Capstone projects and outlined a post-finals audit process intended to improve transparency and procedural clarity going forward. The language was careful and entirely disconnected from any specific incident. But attached to the email was a request. Students were invited to submit feedback regarding their project experience, particularly any concerns about access, evaluation, or oversight. Submissions could be anonymous, but detailed documentation was encouraged. I read the message twice, then forwarded it to Franklin without comment. We did not coordinate our responses. We did not compare drafts or align language. Instead, we submitted independently, each including our documentation, our timelines, and our observations, written without emotional framing or speculative claims. We described what happened, when it happened, and how it affected us. Weeks passed since the email. The semester ended and summer had already begun. The campus was empty and life resumed its forward motion in ways that did not wait for resolution. Then, in mid-July, an update appeared in my inbox. The department had completed its audit. Several procedural changes were announced, including restricted access to student project folders, clearer timestamp verification protocols, and revised guidelines for teaching assistant involvement in competitive evaluations. Buried near the end of the message was a single line, noting that certain evaluations from the previous term had been reassessed, where appropriate. I checked the portal again, my pulse steady this time. Our project grade had been updated, and the penalty was gone. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of error or intent. Just a corrected number, quietly restored to where it should have been all along. A week later, the departmental showcase program was updated. As well, the competing project was no longer listed. Another group had taken its place, one whose work had spoken for itself without intervention. I never heard what happened to Mark. His name disappeared from teaching assignments the following semester. He did not present at the showcase. His doctoral application, if it existed, was no longer a topic of casual conversation. The system did not punish loudly. It adjusted. Franklin and I never celebrated. We acknowledged the outcome with the same restraint we had brought to everything else, understanding that the satisfaction came not from vindication, but from knowing we had endured without becoming what we were resisting. Summer moved slowly, at first. Without deadlines crowding every thought, my body seemed unsure what to do with itself. I slept longer than necessary, woke without alarms, and still felt tired in a way that did not immediately make sense. Stress does not disappear when the source is removed. It lingers, waiting to be metabolized. Franklin and I checked in occasionally, not to revisit what had happened, but to orient ourselves in the absence of it. Our messages were practical, understated, reflective of the partnership we had built under strain. We did not need to process the experience together in dramatic terms. We had already done the work of understanding it while it was unfolding. In late July, I received confirmation that my revised grade had restored my class ranking to where it had been projected before finals week. That adjustment rippled outward, quietly. An honors designation I had assumed was lost reappeared on my transcript. A competitive internship review that had stalled resumed without comment. No one referenced the change directly, but I felt the difference in the way emails were answered, in the tone of administrative correspondence, in the subtle recalibration of expectation. Systems rarely apologize. They simply realign. As the new academic year approached, I returned to campus with a different awareness. I noticed access points, oversight structures, and the informal hierarchies that operated alongside official ones. I paid attention to who had visibility without accountability, who moved between roles without friction, not with suspicion, but with clarity. Franklin and I crossed paths during orientation week, both of us there for separate reasons, pulled back into the orbit of the department by residual obligations. We stood in the same atrium where months earlier I had watched students pass by without really seeing them. This time, the space felt smaller and less imposing. Later that semester, a new policy was introduced requiring all teaching assistants to disclose conflicts of interest and limiting their access to competitive project materials. The policy was framed as a proactive improvement, not a corrective measure. It passed quietly, with little fanfare, and was soon absorbed into the background of departmental operations. By the time winter arrived, finals week had become something I referenced only when asked, a story I could tell without tension rising in my chest. That was how I knew it was over. I graduated the following spring. The ceremony was long, procedural, and emotionally uneven, the way such events tend to be. Names were read, hands were shaken, photos were taken. The institution congratulated itself for our resilience without ever naming what that resilience had required. When my name was called, I walked across the stage without scanning the crowd for validation. I did not need it. The satisfaction I carried was internal, layered, earned through something more durable than recognition. In the months that followed, I entered a professional environment that mirrored academia in more ways than I expected. Hierarchies existed. Power moved laterally, as often as it did vertically. Systems claimed objectivity while being shaped by the people who navigated them most fluently. But I was no longer surprised by this. Finals week had taught me how to exist inside imperfect structures without internalizing their failures as my own. It had shown me that persistence does not always look like confrontation, that documentation can be a form of resistance, that integrity can be maintained without performance. Most importantly, it taught me that frustration does not require an outlet to be resolved. Sometimes it only requires patience, precision, and the willingness to outlast the behavior causing it.